Throughout film history, there has been a clear and dangerous gender imbalance both in front and behind the camera. Men have controlled the movies, and in particular those from Hollywood. Mainstream narrative film, whose conventions are usually associated with classical Hollywood cinema, have been predominantly made by men and are about male protagonists. This inequality in the film industry has perpetuated a lopsided cinematic perspective, where the movies that most people watch end up catering to the interests and desires of men. Such a phenomenon is what Laura Mulvey calls the male gaze.
Sort of cools the ankles.
According to Mulvey, the male gaze is the process in which women in film are turned into scopophilic objects, resulting in the fetishization of their bodies as a source of visual pleasure.
Laura Mulvey describes the male gaze as such.
In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed, with their appearance coded for strong visual and erotic impact, so they can be said to connote to be looked atness. What Mulvey is saying is that women in film are designed, above all else, to be looked at, both by the male characters and the voyeuristic male audiences. This gaze ultimately creates an active-passive division of labor within the narrative. The man actively propels the story forward, while the woman acts as pure passive spectacle, stripped of narrative agency outside of her relations with men. Women become excluded from the linear cause and effect action structure that defines narrative cinema, and thus the most popular films in the world.
But no touching.
Even more problematic are the issues of identification that come with the male gaze. The process in which audiences align with the male character's perspective and subjectivity functions to obfuscate the sexist and oppressive ideological work contained in dominant filmmaking conventions. Mulvey, again. This is made possible through the processes set in motion by structuring the film around a main controlling figure with whom the spectator can identify. As the spectator identifies with the main male protagonist, he projects his look onto that of his like, his screen surrogate, so that the power of the male protagonist as he controls events coincides with the active power of the erotic look. The male protagonist, acting as an ideal surrogate, neutralizes the viewer's ability to see the female character as merely a passive spectacle. This obfuscation is sexism, plain and simple, deeply entrenched in the way we make and watch films. Okay, so why am I reiterating all this? Well, I want to explore how women directors have fought against the male-centric cinema apparatus by comparing two feminist films. Chantal Akerman's 1975 classic Jeanne Dielman, and a much newer film, Coralie Fargeat's directorial debut, Revenge. Claire Johnston states that because of the sexist ideology inherent to filmmaking conventions, new meaning has to be manufactured within filmic texts. She says, "The truth of our oppression cannot be captured on celluloid with the innocence of the camera." So then I want to compare these two films to argue how each woman filmmaker takes a different approach towards their interventions into dominant patriarchal film conventions. In Jeanne Dielman, Akerman wholly defies teleological narrative and crafts a hyper-realist aesthetic to reveal how narrative realism proliferates sexist illusions. In Revenge, Fargeat directly plants herself within narrative and engages in and subverts horror and exploitation tropes to, again, expose the sexist ideology so embedded in dominant filmmaking. So let's break it down. Chantal Akerman's Jeanne Dielman is a 3-hour and 45-minute behemoth that seeks to depict the mundanity and claustrophobia of being a housewife. As Yvonne Marguillet describes in her book Nothing Happens, Akerman seeks to articulate the minor, the banal, the underprivileged, and the minimal in her anti-psychological, sparse, de-dramatized narrative, in an attempt to express thematic concerns with women and the everyday. One can connect these themes to the arguments of Silvia Federici, who published her book Wages Against Housework the same year as the release of Jeanne Dielman. Housework has been transformed into a natural attribute of our female physique and personality, an internal need, an aspiration, supposedly coming from the depths of our female character. And she continues, the unwaged condition of housework has been the most powerful weapon in reinforcing the common assumption that housework is not work, and which makes her work so burdensome and at the same time so invisible. One can see how such polemics also appear in the film form and content of Jeanne Dielman. Akerman refuses all impulses towards realism, a system of narrative and aesthetic conventions that also works to disguise women's oppression, something I've already discussed in relation to the male gaze. Akerman, in many ways, shows life how it is. She turns what would usually be focal points of narrative action into ellipses, instead showing, in excruciating long takes, the daily life of Jeanne's housework, the kind of in-between moments that would be elided in mainstream narrative films. Take this sequence of Jeanne doing dishes. This take goes on for about another 3 minutes, which feels like forever to most audiences' standard. Instead of showing the supposed good stuff, i.e., the kinds of action which Akerman decides to cut away from, Jeanne Dielman predominantly consists of moments like these. Jeanne cooks, she cleans, she goes to the bank, etc., repeatedly over the course of 3 days. Akerman resists dramatic connections between sequences and instead has audiences become immersed in the duration and mundanity of the film itself. Such a radical style of filmmaking accomplishes many things. Akerman's defiance of normative storytelling logic and her boldness in creating such long takes exposes the audience to the compression of time that exists in narrative film, and therefore the illusory reality which these films seek to mask as a cohesive extension of our actual reality. This in turn negates the linearity and forward progression of action that's associated with male protagonists and male temporality, and creates a woman's time of stillness and repetition, a style that thrusts the audience into an unfamiliar and uncomfortable environment while having them share in Jeanne's domestic imprisonment. The illusion of male time becomes subordinated to an encroachment of the very real claustrophobia of a housewife's existence. Furthermore, this hyper-realist aesthetic immerses the audience into the film's duration, which slowly works to highlight the performative aspect of Jeanne's femininity. The film, through its style, is concurring with Federici's argument against the notion that housework comes from the depths of female character. Akerman is intervening into and altering male-centric filmmaking conventions to depict her perspective of women's experience. So, is this Akerman's claim that a woman filmmaker cannot successfully reveal the truth of women's reality through dominant film form? That it requires an overhaul of those aesthetic and narrative traditions? If so, then Coralie Fargeat's Revenge is a pretty compelling argument otherwise. Where Akerman sought to expose the inherent misogyny in normative filmmaking technique by overhauling the entire apparatus, Fargeat uses narrative and genre tropes as a means to critique male-centric cinema, reveal its normalization, and reverse its order. She intervenes into the patriarchal cinema apparatus through the act of engaging in it and then subverting it. The basic plot of Revenge is this. Richard, a wealthy businessman, takes his mistress Jennifer on a getaway retreat to a Moroccan desert. To Richard's surprise, his hunting friends show up a day early. After a night of partying, one of the friends, Dmitri, rapes Jennifer, which triggers a series of events that result in Jennifer's death, her resurrection, and her, you guessed it, revenge. The film, in a political sense, can be broken into two halves, the first of which is a damning condemnation of the male gaze. It sets up the gender hierarchy within the narrative and the process of looking at and fetishizing Jennifer's body in such an exaggerated manner that it's basically impossible not to notice. Just look at this opening shot. The camera insistently traverses and lingers on Jennifer's bare body, and Fargeat consistently cuts shots of Jennifer with the men staring at her in awe. The film deliberately fragments Jennifer into individual body parts to be admired by the male characters, reducing her to a sexual object for the visual pleasure of the men around her. In the process, Fargeat is, through the film's form, paying close attention to the cinematic male gaze, not just by the characters within the film's diegesis, but by the voyeuristic audience as well. Fargeat critiques the normalization of such misogynistic filmmaking technique by forcing the viewer to question their own natural alignment with Richard's perspective and subjectivity. He is, for the most part, a typical male protagonist. Handsome, ultra-masculine, powerful. But while in other movies a male character's sexism might be framed as heroic, even romantic, Richard's misogyny is loud and clear. This is Richard's idea of sensitive pillow talk.
Everything would be so simple if the kids weren't there. And if you didn't have such a nice ass. Where's that little peachy ass of mine? Little juicy peachy ass. It's like a little alien coming from another planet.
The way he purveys her and then shares her amongst his friends shows little in the way of love or intimacy. His gaze, which is correlated with his other symbols of money and power, are seen for what they are: a means of control over Jennifer and her agency. Moments when the narrative stops for the purpose of ogling at and sexualizing Jennifer are gross and sinister, instead of being framed as natural. Fargeat plays with the viewer's conditioned expectations of who Richard should be. Following the rape scene, the viewer may feel a palpable sense of comfort when Richard scolds his friends and sensitively consoles Jennifer.
Hey.
Call the helicopter. Call the helicopter, I want to go home.
Hey, calm down. I'll take care of everything, okay? Don't worry.
It appears to be a return to the familiar image of the protective, controlling male archetype, which would run contrast to what we've seen up until that point. But then this happens.
Everything's okay. I fixed everything. I made a few phone calls to find you a job. In Canada.
Then this.
Okay, they're fucked up big time. But you're so damn beautiful too, it's hard to resist you.
Then this.
Who the fuck do you think you are? You little whore? Dare threaten me or fuck things up in my life? Don't you ever talk about my wife. Don't you ever say her name.
And then this. that standard image of the protective male is set up to then be stripped away. With the shattering of what would be Richard's typical narrative arc, and the shock such a turn provides, audiences may begin to recognize the deeply ingrained gender codes that exist within mainstream cinema, and realize how readily they accept such reductive and constructed gender ideology. Fargeat uses these codes in such a way that it explicitly points the audience in their direction to show how dangerous they are. Next, I think it's important to discuss the rape scene itself within the context of the rape revenge subgenre, an exploitation trope whose merit I am in no position to qualify. But since I'm arguing that Fargeat uses certain tropes to make her own feminist commentary, I will do my best to explain.
No.
And yet you seemed to like me yesterday.
Many have argued that the genre is designed for male audiences to take pleasure in the depiction of sexual violence against women. Others have argued that these kinds of narratives are ultimately empowering. Meanwhile, film scholar Carol J. Clover, analyzing the 1979 film I Spit on Your Grave in her book Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film, suggests a cross-gender identification with the genre. She states, "The only way to account for the spectator's engagement in the revenge drive is to assume his engagement with the rape-avenging woman. The center of gravity in these films lies more in the reaction, the revenge, than the act, the rape." Clearly, there are a variety of critical analyses of the genre, which Alexandra Heller-Nicholas in her book, Rape Revenge Films: A Critical Study, attempts to reconcile. She states, "If there is a broader cultural confusion regarding how to tackle rape revenge films, it is because the films themselves reflect a broader cultural confusion about rape more generally. Conflicting attitudes towards rape have and continue to coexist. Because of this diversity, the rape revenge film allows a broad range of ideological debates to be explored. It is often, but not always, how these rapes are depicted, as well as the context of those depictions, that propel the narratives and the filmic experiences of the spectator more generally." Heller-Nicholas argues, then, that it's important to analyze each film on its own terms. In this context, it is interesting to look at the rape scene in Revenge. The rape is predominantly represented acoustically over the image of one of Richard's friends ignoring and walking away from the assault, washing out the screams with a TV.
Tu vois pas qu'on est occupé? Alors si tu veux en profiter, tu entres, sinon tu te casses et tu fermes la porte.
The scene is just as interested in Dmitri ignoring the assault as it is in representing the horrors of the rape itself.
In this sense, it's as if Fargeat avoids the exploitation of Jennifer's rape as the justification of the bloody catharsis that follows, and instead sees Jennifer's revenge drive as taking vengeance on the larger global issues of rape culture and the dismissal of victims of sexual violence and misogyny more generally. It could also be seen as taking revenge on the male gaze itself, and those that might have taken pleasure in Jennifer's objectification and her inevitable punishment, while ignoring the real-world consequences of such voyeurism. The second half of the film can be seen as the reversal of the ironic setup seen in the first half. Firstly, I think Claire Johnston is valuable once again to help parse what's going on here. Talking about how to create a feminist film within the dominant mode, she says, "Romanticism will not provide us with the necessary tools to construct a women's cinema. A desire for change can only come about by drawing on fantasy. Any revolutionary strategy must challenge the depiction of reality. It is not enough to discuss the oppression of women within the text of the film. The language of the cinema, the depiction of reality, must also be interrogated, so that a break between ideology and text is effected." So she's saying to depict reality as it is simply to show the dominant ideology, which works to oppress and exclude women. So Johnston suggests creating an alternate reality, a fantasy, within the text. And speaking of fantasy,
Peachy ass. What is it you don't like about me?
Fargeat creates a fantasy world through which Jennifer now has the means to take revenge on her male oppressors. And in this world, the gaze is flipped. Jennifer gains the power of vision as she takes narrative agency back into her own hands. The camera now treats her as the protagonist, the star. Okay, so now I've outlined both films and how they subvert the dominant patriarchal filmmaking mode. The question remains, how successful are they? I'd say Jeanne Dielman is an undeniably successful and classic feminist film that expresses its revolutionary politics through revolutionary filmmaking form. Revenge is a little bit more debatable. I've loved this film ever since I saw its Midnight Madness premiere at TIFF 2 years ago. It's a gorgeously made film, but it's important to see how it maybe perpetuates the very issues it seeks to expose. Seen through an uncritical lens, the film's sexualization of Jennifer and the whole concept of rape revenge can be put under intense scrutiny. The fact that it has to hammer in its feminist themes at the end possibly speaks to how the rest of the film could be misinterpreted.
But you had to put up a fight. Women
So, can narrative film ever truly be feminist while it engages in dominant formulations? The possibility seems to be there, even if it's proven to be very difficult. Mulvey's argument is still pertinent to this day. But criticisms of Mulvey attack her exclusion of women spectators and filmmakers from narrative cinema. So should the representation of women in these kinds of films be seen as such a futile effort? I think Johnston sees the potential for revolutionary feminist film to exist even within narrative conventions. She says, women's objectification cannot be overcome simply by examining it artistically. It can only be challenged by developing the means to interrogate the male bourgeois cinema. We should seek to operate at all levels, within the male-dominated cinema and outside it. As I've tried to argue, Jeanne Dielman and Revenge both try to do that in their respective ways.